Feels pretty good to know that I was alive and fortunate enough to have a good chunk of disposable income during that era when some of the all-time best video games were ever made. I'm talking about the mid to late 2000s and 2011 in particular, with the release of Rocksteady's Batman Arkham City, which also went up against Dead Space 2, The Witcher 2, and even Elder Scrolls Skyrim. As a sequel to 2009's Arkham Asylum, it's the kind of game that even people who weren't hardcore fans of the comics, aka me, were still incredibly keen for.
I was hoping you'd say that.
And it's kind of hard to overstate the hype surrounding it at the time, especially considering it really looked like they were building upon what they created with Asylum, which was more or less universally loved, and rightfully so. I still remember watching that cinematic trailer for the first time and being absolutely blown away, thinking this was as good as pre-rendered graphics were ever going to get, and even 12-something years later, that trailer still delivers the goods.
Who sent you?
You go strange.
In fact, you could even find this guy's poor dead body in the finished game as an Easter egg. So yeah, needless to say, when it finally launched, it was worth the wait, and it's really one of those rare gaming experiences where something comes out and you just end up playing it more or less 24/7 until the whole thing comes to an end.
This is where you're gonna die.
Back during a time before I had a wife, a kid, or a job I had to take seriously, and could devote 8 to 10 hours of my day playing through a video game without any kind of serious backlash.
This court is now in session.
So, seeing as the devs are due back in 2024 with the upcoming Suicide Squad game, thought it might be worth going back and taking a look at Rocksteady's masterpiece to see if it still stacks up. Spoilers, it does. Right, so the story goes, after what happened in Arkham Asylum, with the facilities not being deemed effective anymore, the worse off slum areas of Gotham have now been converted into an asylum and a prison, hence the title. During the prologue, Bruce Wayne is there to protest the development, only to be captured by Doctor Strange and his Tiger mercenaries and taken hostage.
Remember, Wayne is the priority target.
The big catch here, though, is that Strange knows that Bruce Wayne is Batman, which was a bit of a nice hook for the trailer and gets brought up a couple of times throughout the story, but ultimately, he never really bothers doing anything with it, outside of just kind of using it as a bit of a vague threat.
And if you try to stop me, I guarantee everyone will know your secret.
Shut up!
Anyway, during the prologue, Batman soon breaks free, with his first clue being to investigate something Strange is planning on unleashing called Protocol 10, rubbing shoulders with Catwoman, Two-Face, the Penguin, Mr. Freeze, and of course the Joker along the way.
There's plenty wrong with me.
And it's kind of sad, isn't it, saying that ensemble out loud, knowing that we'll never get a Batman game like this ever again. Especially since the sad passing of Arlene Sorkin, who played Harley Quinn, not to mention Kevin Conroy as Batman, who really was the perfect embodiment of the character.
Today is not a good day to push me, Victor.
Hearing him alongside Mark Hamill's iconic performance as the Joker, it's like putting milk and cookies together, and you always knew you were in for a good time. So it should go without saying that the dialogue and the story is masterfully written stuff, and definitely one of its biggest strengths, and it's just always constantly going on to that next big thing without ever really feeling like it's dragging its feet.
Things could get worse, much worse.
You think?
You start off rescuing Catwoman from Two-Face and his goons, which is simple enough, to then having to track down the Joker in a steel mill, where it turns out he's got some kind of blood disease which he lovingly passes on to Batman as well.
There's a teeny little bit of me in you too, Bats.
Then it becomes a race to find Mr. Freeze, hoping he can help create an antidote, only he's being held captive by the Penguin.
So, Batman, you here for the cops? The Iceman.
Which, if you can believe it, not only requires finding and rescuing Freeze himself, but also slowly walking across a partially frozen lake, rescuing undercover cops whilst also avoiding a giant shark, which is aptly named Tiny, which is the same nickname your mum gives me. The city more or less has the same overall layout of the asylum, with it being all these detailed interior areas with a semi-open world hub of sorts connecting them all together. And every single one of these locations is jam-packed with stuff to see and do. Like, I really like too how every time you come back to that central frozen area in the museum where you've got to rescue Mr. Freeze, the water in the middle keeps melting more and more, giving you less space to work with. And it's that kind of level of detail that just isn't limited to those interior environments either, because Arkham City is absolutely packed with things happening, and often it just feels like one Easter egg after another. Compared to Asylum, where you really spent just most of the time getting around on foot, occasionally gliding or grappling up to a ledge, in City you can more or less glide around the entire time. Early on, the game introduces the grapnel boost, where you can grapple up to a high enough point and then launch right into a glide, and this becomes a fast and effective way to get around. But it also introduces what was a source of much frustration for me as a younger man, and that's all of those augmented reality training courses, where you gotta fly through a bunch of rings like it's Superman 64.
Augmented reality training complete.
And while the first few of these are pretty easy, the advanced ones are the stuff that's gonna have you pulling the hairs out of your balls and ass cheeks. Let me just say that if you commit yourself to beating these, there's gonna be one particular line of dialogue that's gonna be burned into your brain.
Augmented reality training failed. Augmented reality training failed.
No way! It's the bat!
Augmented reality training failed.
Luckily though, Arkham City came out during the height of game FAQs being a reliable source of information and assistance in beating these kind of sections in video games, so thankfully that pain didn't last all that long.
Augmented reality training complete.
Oh, thank God!
Can I just take a moment to mention too, just how absolutely amazing this game still looks, which really is the perfect example of how an amazing art style can keep something looking absolutely timeless. And gliding around the city, seeing the streets littered with loitering thugs and garbage whilst the moon hangs in the sky, like, it just looks awesome. When you're moving around the city, you can often listen in on the chatter from nearby inmates, and some of this stuff is genuinely funny to listen to, really making it all feel like you're in a lived-in place.
Look out, it's Batman!
This thing came out during the peak of Unreal Engine 3 popularity, and it's a great example of that technology being used to its absolute fullest. It's kind of funny to think how people used to always bitch and moan whenever this engine popped up again, you know, considering it's one of the engines that's really stood the test of time. There's just so many little minor incidental details they've packed into the game here, like how you can run through piles of leaves or paper and see them all whoosh up under your feet, the way snow and water reacts to your movement, and even just some of the smaller things. Like during the prologue, being able to see Bruce's reflection in Stranger's glasses, followed by a full-on working mirror. Yeah, mirrors in video games, remember those things?
You are mine, new inmates. Let me introduce myself.
I actually really love this whole prologue sequence too, getting that first glimpse of Arkham City as you walk outside, totally capturing the pure chaos and lawlessness you're getting yourself thrust into. And also because it's one of those rare moments where we get to see Batman outside of his suit. Doesn't overstay its welcome either, going for barely 10 or so minutes before getting right into things, letting you beat up Penguin and his thugs and then promptly getting your hands on the Batsuit. And I mean, look, compare that to prologues in most modern games, man, you know, which often run for 2 or 3 fucking hours. There's also some genuinely impressive character modeling on offer here too, stuff that was really years ahead of its time.
It would be a shame to get blood all over my nice new outfit. What do you think, Batbrain? Like it?
Batman himself obviously looks awesome, and you can tell the guy's been definitely hitting the squat rack on his days off. Plus the way his suit continually gets more damaged throughout the campaign just shows how much of a physical toll this ordeal is taken on him.
Are you trying to talk me out of this?
I also really like this version of Catwoman and Harley Quinn for obvious reasons.
Who wouldn't?
Yeah, back during a time when Western video games were allowed to have attractive female characters and there wouldn't be an uproar. In fact, funnily enough, I think this version of Harley Quinn is more reserved and sensible than the one we got in Asylum, and definitely far less annoying than the one we got in Arkham Knight.
It was that stinking bat-faced loser! Don't you dare!
Talia al Ghul is also another perfect example of this, and also a perfect example of how much willpower Bruce has as a man. Because, I mean, goddamn son, if a woman who looked like that wanted me to put a kid in her, and the only catch was that I actually had to kill criminals, well, I'd be running that League of Assassins faster than you could make yourself a cup of tea.
Then may the spirits be kind.
Jokes aside, even just those stock standard bad guys like Two-Face and the Penguin are really unique iterations, with Cobblepot being this full-on Cockney git this time.
Come on out, lads. It's initiation time.
With what looks like the bottom of a glass bottle over his eye serving as that trademark monocle.
Hold still, boy.
It's also kind of insane to think that he's voiced by Nolan North. Yeah, Nathan Drake himself. And I mean, listen to those two characters back to back and consider it's the same voice actor.
Oh, you remember me? I'm touched.
And of course, it wouldn't be a mid-2000s video game if Troy Baker and Steve Bloom weren't in there somewhere as well.
Bring out the defendant.
With Baker voicing Two-Face and Robin, and Steve Bloom, I think, voicing 90% of the random NPCs you come across.
You think?
We also finally get to see Mr. Freeze in the game as well as this tall, super imposing and menacing figure, towering above Batman in his Vader-esque cold suit and speaking in that very iconic electronic voice. My only gripe here is the absolute dependency that these stories have on using the Joker. And yes, I know this guy's the yin to Batman's yang and all that, but it just gets kind of repetitive how every single one of these Arkham games has to have the guy almost front and center.
But everyone's dying to see what I do next.
Even in Arkham Knight, where they make a very clear point of showing that he's actually dead, he still comes back as a vision to haunt Batman throughout the story. Still though, as someone who's not a super hardcore fan of the comics, the story has always been the main thing that's kept me coming back. And the way that it keeps introducing all the members of the Rogue Gallery is just kinda seamless.
We'll see about that.
Right, so where the actual gameplay is concerned, Arkham City is really just a bit of an upgrade across the board in every way from Asylum. To the point that when I go back and replay through Asylum after City, it really feels like I'm stepping back in time, which it is.
Which it is.
Now with the combat, for instance, and fighting all those nameless henchmen, in Asylum, the most you ever fought was maybe like half a dozen or so guys at once. Here now in City, you'll fight easily upwards of a dozen and barely break a sweat. It always kind of reminds me of that line of dialogue from Batman Begins about fighting 6 men versus engaging 600.
You know how to fight 6 men. We can teach you how to engage 600.
And even one of the first fights in the entire campaign, when you're trying to save Catwoman, has you dropping down from the ceiling into a whole bunch of Two-Face's goons. Literally right into the fray and having to beat them all down at once.
Hold still while I pass judgment.
The way the campaign slowly introduces these more challenging enemy combinations is also masterfully handled. Early on, you're really just fighting dudes who use their fists and metal pipes. But then by the end of the game, you're up against guys with knives, there's guys with riot shields, stun batons, ninjas, and even guys decked out in body armor. You get into that rhythm of being able to instantly assess what kind of enemy needs what approach. And at that point, the combat becomes second nature. Like for the guys with the riot shields, you first have to stun them with the cape. Then you can jump on top of them and smash them from above, like some kind of horrible face-sit scenario gone wrong.
This is gonna hurt, Bat!
The guys with the stun batons are similar to Asylum, where you just need to leap over their back to hit them from behind. And as for the guys with the body armor, they'll need to be stunned firstly as well. Then you can finally beat on them over and over like a Cherokee drum until their internal organs are completely pulverized. Enemies again also carry knives and other sharp pointy things, but thankfully this time, they've added in a move where you can actually avoid and counter it to take them down instantly. I will admit though that even over a decade later, I still kind of struggle with this takedown combo. I mean, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and I still haven't really figured out here what I'm doing wrong. But it is really awesome though when it actually works, and it feels far more Batman-y than just avoiding them entirely. More than that though, the combat also feels like a bit of a sandbox for the AI, because there's always going to be weapons strewn around the ground for them to use too. They'll grab boxes, they'll grab propane tanks, and they'll even go and pick up guns, and it's pretty cool seeing these guys dynamically move around the arena to adapt depending on what's happening. Button mashing won't get you very far either, and the critical strike feature, returning from Asylum, really encourages you to be more patient. And I've always kind of thought that those combat takedowns were a really handy way of giving you a few precious seconds to quickly scan your surroundings, and then figure out what you wanted to do next and who took top priority.
You're gonna die tonight, Batman.
Knowing that you've always got the moveset to counter whatever the game throws at you, and being able to implement that without even having to think about it is what makes the whole combat loop so much fucking fun. And the fact too that City adds in a whole new move which can let you destroy weapons entirely, it makes you feel even more like you've got total control over things. In Asylum, you were also kind of limited in your movesets. I mean, you had the same basic combo system, but this would often reset without you really meaning for it to happen. And it wasn't always possible to get through entire fights without resetting it.
This is gonna stop him.
However, in Arkham City, you can get through pretty much entire encounters and the combo counter never once breaks, getting upwards of 50 or even 100.
Cool. Yeah, it is cool.
And along with those new combat combo upgrades like the Bat Swarm, which stuns nearby enemies, it makes it even easier to just keep racking that counter higher and higher, performing near superhuman feats as you fly across the room in nanoseconds to wipe some poor asshole off the map. But the thing I prefer most about the combat in Arkham City is being able to quick fire gadgets. Being able to quickly fire off one of Batman's toys during combat, which was good at not only keeping that combo counter going, but also just keeping certain enemy types at bay. Quick firing enemies with the electric charge would stun them for a few seconds, and then later on, hitting someone with Freeze's grenade would keep them encased in ice, completely unable to even fight back. Yeah, how you like them apples?
The Iceman cometh.
But one of my favorite things to do is to use the Bat Claw to latch onto enemies and pull them towards you like it's Scorpion Spear from Mortal Kombat, setting them up perfectly for a goddamn clothesline.
Come here!
And in fact, a lot of the time, I try to end fights with this move specifically. I don't know, man, something about that slow motion animation, watching Batman pummel some hardened criminal into the ground, and into what I'm guessing is going to be months and months of physical therapy, just never gets old. It just meant that you really felt like you were putting Batman's entire arsenal to good use, and you got rewarded for it accordingly at the end of each fight with the XP system, which also made you want to get into fights as much as possible. You'd come across these rooms that you had to pass through that were already full with like a whole platoon of bad guys, and a lot of the time, you'd be given the controls to initiate combat, often for an instant takedown, just to show these guys that you really mean business. Just really epitomizes the famous saying, I'm not trapped in here with you, you're all trapped in here with me.
Ooh, aren't you scary?
You're about to find out.
I mean, look, yeah, having sex is cool and all, but have you ever fought a dozen guys in Arkham City like this and come out the other end without taking a single hit? And I mean, to this day, I still can't think of any other game that makes you feel like such an utter badass in hand-to-hand combat. I mean, I could say Doom Eternal, but that's not entirely fair in some ways, given the Slayer's insane weapon roster. As far as superhero games go though, Arkham City is still the apex, and that simple act of just gliding around the city and then taking on a small group of bad guys otherwise minding their own business is still immensely fun. I mean, just think about it. These guys were innocently chatting about how much they wanted to bang Harley Quinn, and the next thing they know, Batman's come out of nowhere and removed their front teeth with the bottom of his back boots. So there is a reason why people look back so fondly on how the combat controls in this game. Well, most people anyway. And the sheer freedom and the control it gives you on handing out concussions over and over to would-be thugs plays a pretty damn big part in that. The other component of the gameplay is the Predator mode, where you stay out of sight and then come in and attack from the shadows, kind of like Chris Hansen. This is more or less unchanged from Asylum. You're always up against guys armed with guns, and taking them head on is more or less suicide. So it's all about taking them out silently from behind. Heartbeat monitors return as well, so whenever you take someone out, everyone else in the room is going to be alerted to their absence.
4 left. Work harder.
And as a result, be more on their guard, so by the time you get to that last guy in the room, he's usually about ready to shit his pants. Now, the way they've tried to change this up in Arkham City is with a few new additions. Firstly, there's guys wearing night vision goggles who can see you hiding up in the gargoyles. Secondly, there's often going to be guys walking around with jammers, not to be confused with Jammer-Lammy on the PS1, which makes your detective vision impossible to use until they're dealt with. And then thirdly, there's guys walking around putting down explosive mines, which make running around on the ground a lot trickier. The thing is though, you can counter all of these pretty easily. Firstly, there's an upgrade, so you're still hidden from those guys with the night vision. Secondly, you can simply just focus on the guys with the jammer packs first to remove the debuff. And as for the explosive mines, well, they can eventually be turned against your enemies as well.
You heard the boss!
So again, just like the combat component, City is dialing up the challenge during the Predator mode, but it's also giving you those much needed tools to adapt to it. There's even the option for a double silent takedown as well, which is an absolute godsend, and really handy when two bad guys are standing right next to each other.
This is over. I'm gonna make you regret this.
You can also now do a grate takedown, whereas in Asylum you had to hop out of the grate first, which, I don't know, kind of defeated the purpose of using one of those things as a hiding place to begin with. The best new toy though is the Disruptor, a gadget which can jam a firearm so enemies can't even use it. And what I've always liked to do with this thing was wait until there were 2 guys left, then I jam both of their guns and hand out a beatdown to one of them smack bang in front of the other. All the while imagining the fear that this guy'd be feeling, trying to fire off his jammed weapon knowing that his ass was going to be the next one to be kicked, and not being able to do a damn thing about it. And this right here is the shit that makes this game so much fun. And part of why I keep coming back to replay it year after year, because this kind of role-playing and immersion just totally encapsulates you in the character. I mean, surely I'm not the only one who randomly sits on top of the streetlights in plain sight, letting the inmates taunt me for a bit before then dropping down and ramming my bat fist up their ass.
I knew you were too chicken to come down here and fight me.
I still think it's really awesome too how if you ever aim a remote batarang back at Batman to try to hit him, he simply catches it in midair like a total boss.
That's awesome.
I will say that I do wish there were more of these Predator sequences overall, which is about the only complaint I have there. But even still, I've lost count of the amount of times I used to replay these sections over and over, trying to do it as efficiently as possible for no other reason than my own self-gratification.
Who's screaming?
Now outside of the story, the combat and the stealth, there's what's probably the final component to Arkham City, and that's the all-new Riddler Challenges.
Questions, Dark Knight.
If you've played Arkham Asylum, you'll remember how that guy couldn't help but chime in every single time he solved one of his riddles to talk a bunch of shit.
I'm losing patience. You're cheating. You must be.
Now in the sequel, he's got an entire city as his playground, and you can't go 5 seconds without seeing one of those trophies on a rooftop or hidden in some back alleyway. But even then, aside from the dozens and dozens of trophies, there's also the abundance of riddles themselves, which involves scanning a specific object or landmark along with the various in-game challenges, like gliding a certain distance without touching the ground or reaching a certain combo count during combat. And then on top of that, early on in the campaign, the Riddler kidnaps a bunch of doctors and hides them away in all of these death trap rooms.
You answer my riddles and I tell you where they are.
Tucked away in the various ass cracks of the city.
I've done it. This is one puzzle you cannot solve.
Which makes him far less Jim Carrey and more Jigsaw this time, putting these poor bastards into these highly elaborate scenarios which look like the kind of thing you'd see on a live leak video. The catch though is that he's only going to reveal where the next victim is after you've found a certain amount of riddles. So this time there is an actual incentive to find all of these and rescue these poor SOBs. You know, from being horrifically mangled, electrocuted or bored to death by awful puns.
Why doesn't he just tell you what he wants?
Because he's insane.
Hold it, Riddler.
And I still remember spending hours on my old PS3 finding the couple of hundred or so of these he's got hidden away. A lot of which you can't even get on first attempt, because they require specific gadgets and upgrades you're not even going to get until late in the game.
This is hardly a surprise. I always knew I was better than you.
What does help to speed up the process though is the way the game is going to show you the locations of these riddles, after you squeeze the information out of some of Riddler's informants.
Please, don't hurt me. I'll tell you what you want to know.
Yeah, these are otherwise innocuous goons who just happen to glow brightly, like they've had a bath in a tub of uranium or something, but letting you clearly know that they're the ones holding all the goods. And from a gameplay perspective, this is kind of clever as well, because it adds yet another layer of skill to the combat. I mean, in the sense that you could just knock these guys out like anyone else, but keeping them standing until they're the last one left lets you interrogate them for that much needed info. I also had no idea until recently that the animations for interrogating these guys were so dynamic. Like if you interrogate one of them near the edge of something, Batman's going to drop them over the side to loosen their bowels along with their tongue. And in going on 12 years of replaying this game, this is the first time I ever saw that animation.
Don't make me hurt you.
I'll tell you what I know.
Thank you.
But the best part about doing those Riddler challenges was that it unlocked all the challenge maps in the main menu. And this right here, man, is where anyone who played Arkham City back in the day spent the majority of their time. All of these various combat and stealth scenarios you could play over and over to get the best possible result. And there was honestly a point on the PS3 where I really had some of the best all-time leaderboard scores. Well, you know, the best leaderboard scores that clearly weren't cheating.
Nobody cares.
In fact, I'd even argue you could spend more time trying to beat and master all of these than you'd spend with the main part of the game. Especially considering you can play through all of them with all the various DLC outfits and characters. And it's really kind of staggering the sheer amount of value and content you are getting on this mode alone.
This is hardly a surprise.
Even outside of the Riddler Challenges though, there's still just so much interesting side content to experience, which you'd kind of hope for considering you're in a city full of the hardest criminals on Earth, you know, outside of Western Sydney.
I need to find and destroy the rest of the Titan containers.
I mean, you got Victor Zsasz running around calling you on payphones, regaling the stories about why his life is so fucked up, piece by piece as you finally track him down. Azrael pops up on random rooftops, keeping an eye on Batman's performance. You've got Deadshot assassinating political prisoners just for the hell of it. Plus, there's also the inklings of a serial killer, going around cutting people's faces off like he's Hannibal Lecter.
The press have nicknamed the killer the Identity Thief.
Silence of the Lambs.
There's even a whole side mission helping Bane to destroy a bunch of Titan tanks which are hidden across the city, ending in the two of you fighting alongside each other, friendly fire included. And probably what's one of the weirdest ones where you get drugged and kidnapped by the Mad Hatter, having to fight back inside this weird nightmarish dream world as you try to regain your sanity.
Stop fighting it.
I mean, it doesn't really hold a candle to all the Scarecrow sequences in Asylum, which, let's be honest, is a goddamn art piece, but I gotta say, it comes pretty damn close. And I still remember the bruise that my jaw got when it hit the floor back in 2011 when I first experienced this for the first time.
All we need now is a finishing touch.
At any time as well, you can also swap out to play as Catwoman, who's got her own Riddler trophies to find as well, and that's like an entirely different experience altogether.
I think I'm going to enjoy this.
Crikey.
She's got the same basic combat moves as Batman, but her animation is much more fluid and athletic, taking advantage of her nimble size as opposed to Batman's brute force. And her gadgets also kind of reflect that, being more about subduing enemies. I gotta say that I still haven't ever managed to get the hang of her parkour and movement controls though. It's a bit of a rhythm-based mechanic where you need to press the jump button at just the right time to scale up buildings, and even over a decade later I haven't managed to nail it, much like Catwoman.
Sorry to disappoint you boys.
Her dialogue and voice acting is also really entertaining stuff too, making it a stark contrast to Batman's constant brooding, where it really does give off the kind of vibe of a man who really just needs to get his pipes cleaned.
Does it look like I have a choice?
And when I looked up the IMDb page for Selina's voice actress, I was surprised to find out that it seems she's done the voice for every single animated character that ever existed. I mean, check out this portfolio. Damn. She's even got her own unique boss fights as well, kind of anyway, going up against Ivy and her sentient plants, complete with the kind of tentacles that look like they somehow escaped from a Japanese anime.
I understood that reference.
Speaking of boss fights, it'd be remiss of me to not mention these. And it's really one of the few games alongside the Metal Gear Solid series where I actually look forward to the boss encounters.
Accept your destiny!
First couple, if you can really call them that, are two guys who work for the Joker, conjoined Russian twins named Hammer and Sickle, yeah, how creative, that both require a serious beatdown whilst also avoiding the dozen odd henchmen that are backing them up. Then the fight after that though is a short-lived one against the Penguin, who expectedly gets dropped like a bad smell, but in a nice little bait and switch, is quickly followed by a proper fight against the reanimated Solomon Grundy.
Shit just got real.
Now to even damage this guy, you first got to destroy power generators around the area, whilst also avoiding Grundy's attacks, and more discharges than your mother experiences on a Saturday night.
Those things are antiques! Leave them alone!
The next boss fight after that is against Ra's al Ghul, and the only way to describe this whole thing is that it's a goddamn fever dream. Not only does Batman have to glide around this surreal, psychedelic realm without touching anything, but then go toe-to-toe with Ra's himself as an out-of-body experience almost, fueled by centuries-old demonic blood. Yes, that's literally what is going on here.
You should have joined us.
This is great!
And it's still one of the coolest boss fights in any game I've ever played. Not to mention the backdrop really allows them to make it as outlandish as they want, seeing as the whole thing is more of a metaphor for Batman's mental fight as opposed to his physical one. The way it's spliced with all those brief moments of clarity as Batman temporarily regains his senses and awareness is masterful stuff, not only from a storytelling perspective, but also just on a technical level. In fact, this fight was so good that they even outright recycled some of the animations during the Deathstroke fight in Arkham Origins.
They're the same picture.
Then of course there's what's easily the best boss encounter in the entire game against Mr. Freeze himself, inside the GCPD building when he suddenly has a change of heart I suppose, and decides he doesn't want to help Batman anymore. Yeah, what a dick.
You don't want to do this, Freeze.
I'm afraid that my condition has left me cold.
Basically plays out like one of the Predator sequences where you need to avoid Freeze as he patrols the area. But the catch is that whenever you use a tactic against him, Freeze adapts to your playstyle, and then alters the area so you can't use the same trick twice. And it's a really superb cat and mouse scenario where you can even use Freeze's own strategy against him, using Batman's heat signature to bait him into certain areas, destroying walls to stun him, or using the electric charge to immobilize him completely, before then rushing in and dishing out a bit of an ass whooping. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, while Batman's fists are a dish best served piping hot.
Cool party.
The only boss fight I don't like all that much here is the final one against Clayface, only because that guy seems like a bit of a B-tier villain, and you've already spent pretty much the entire game going up against the S-tier guys. It also just relies a lot on spamming a particular gadget, and also has some ludicrously small counter windows to actually damage him in return. And while I'm on the subject of overall critiques, I guess my main issue is just with the pacing of the campaign, mostly which comes from all of those Catwoman sequences.
Oh, come on.
Now on launch, you only had to play through this stuff if you pre-ordered the game, but now with the Game of the Year edition, which really is the best way to play this thing otherwise, you're forced to experience it. It opens up with Selina trying to steal a bunch of stuff from Two-Face's safe, which explains why she's being held captive in the courthouse when you take control of Batman in the main game.
Get your filthy paws off that now.
After that, there's another sequence where you've got to meet up with Poison Ivy, who is super pissed off at Selina for not taking care of her bushes. Not a euphemism.
Stop that!
Before the sequence after that, where she's breaking into one of the Arkham City vaults to steal a bunch of loot, only to then give it all up to go off and help Batman, which again explains why she randomly shows up to save him later in the story.
Since when did you grow a conscience?
Since when did you become the physical type?
And I don't so much mind all of that stuff, but it's the epilogue that completely kills the pacing. Because after you beat the main story as Batman, you've then got to play through this final sequence as Selina, which goes on for like half an hour, tracking down Two-Face, who's hiding in the museum. And there is some cool fight sequences here to be fair, but it's all just recycling the same areas you've already played. The final encounter against Two-Face as well is just another Predator sequence, again in the same area where you already played as Batman, and it really just kind of feels like a lazy way to pad the content out.
What?
You gotta sneak around the entire time performing multiple takedowns on Two-Face, whilst also avoiding all of his goons who just keep spawning in. And Catwoman just isn't as well designed for this kind of stealth mode as Batman was, so the whole section just really suffers.
Enough with the twos already.
The whole point of this, as Selina soon finds out, is that Two-Face destroyed her booty. Again, not a euphemism. Which does explain why she stays around in the city to help out Batman. But it really didn't need to be a 30-minute long epilogue preventing you from being able to finally free roam. And I just feel like that plot detail could have been summed up in a single sentence of dialogue, which it is.
Some enterprising individuals decided to help themselves to my things. I intend to get it all back.
Shut up!
Still though, that more or less concludes the Arkham City experience. After that, you can try out the New Game Plus mode or spend hours and hours in free roam, finishing all the side content you missed, or playing dress up in the many Ultimate Batsuits, including Terry's suit from Batman Beyond, which is sadly the closest we'll ever get to having another game based off that incredibly underrated series. Then eventually, when all is said and done, when all the criminals are dealt with, and the Riddler's finally had his big mouth shut, you close the book on one of the all-time greatest superhero games ever made. Hopefully, finally understanding why this thing is as loved as it is. And that does beg the question, like, where do you possibly go from this point on? Well, I'm glad you asked, because the answer is we got 2 other games. Arkham Origins released in 2013 before Rocksteady finally finished the trilogy in 2015 with Arkham Knight. Arkham Origins is interesting, firstly because it's not actually developed by Rocksteady, it was instead developed by Warner Bros. Montreal, who also worked on the recent Gotham Knights. Yeah, yikes. And much like Gotham Knights felt like a bit of a cheap imitation, in some ways so does Origins. And the reason is because it kind of is, it's a spin-off title made by a different studio. The second reason it's interesting is because it tries to tell something of an origin story, obviously, hence the title, with the story taking place 8 years before Asylum, when Batman's only in his second year as Gotham's self-appointed protector. This also means the GCPD doesn't really trust him yet, and he doesn't have the same relationship with Jim Gordon either. But that doesn't stop him from doing what needs to be done, that being causing grievous bodily harm to all manner of criminals. And I actually think the story is one of the game's biggest strengths. The whole thing opens with Batman trying to stop a breakout at Blackgate Prison, only to find out that the crime lord Black Mask has put a $50 million bounty out on his head, which means that every scum-sucking bad guy from Killer Croc to Deathstroke is out to get him. And it is cool seeing some of these iconic villains in their earlier days. Not to mention Batman having to go toe-to-toe with corrupt cops at a time when the force was in disarray is pretty unique, and something I don't think the other games ever explored. It also has what might be one of the absolute funniest boss fights of all time.
Now there's a naughty geezer. Proper naughty.
Now I say boss fight, but it's more like a Raiders of the Lost Ark boss fight, where Batman just TKOs the Electrocutioner with a single kick.
This fight only 2 hits. Me hitting you and...
You got knocked the fuck out.
It even had that really awesome cinematic trailer as well, showing Batman narrowly avoiding death when taken on Deathstroke, so the elements were there for another solid entry. The problem is that whole assassination plot is really just a bit of a ruse, because it's not actually Black Mask the entire time, and it's soon revealed to be an early iteration of the Joker pulling the strings, because like every other Arkham game, they can't resist putting this guy front and fucking center.
It's been you this whole time. You hired the assassins.
Gameplay-wise, it more or less just plays like Arkham City with a few modifications here and there, most notably that a lot of those really useful gadgets and abilities don't show up until really late in the game. Critical hits, for instance, a mechanic which is really useful in racking up the combo counter, can only be unlocked after finishing an optional side mission, which doesn't even come up until about halfway through the campaign. What's always been my main issue though is that I've always felt like the combat in this one just feels sluggish and less responsive. Almost like there's some kind of input delay or something, and I always seem to get hit way more here than I do in the other games.
You fought well, Batman, but I am stronger.
Not how this was supposed to go!
And to be honest, I've often wondered if they did this on purpose, seeing as it's supposed to be Year 2 Batman where he's still finding his groove. So maybe on some level this was almost intentional to really emphasize that bit of lack that he has in combat experience. That's the only explanation I could come up with, outside of the obvious being that they just fucked up and ruined a perfectly good combat system. Overall though, it's not that bad, and if you can overlook a lot of the recycled environments, recycled animations, recycled mechanics, not to mention an awful map layout that forces you to fast travel, the whole thing's okay.
You think these ties will hold me?
Maybe not.
I do like the concept of being able to stop actual crimes in progress now, and the updated crime scene investigation mechanics, where you replicate past events in this sort of virtual simulation, is almost verbatim to what they'd introduced in Arkham Knight. Even the concept of that perfect counter, waiting until just the last second to press the counter button, is something that Knight would also bring across. But at the end of the day, it feels and plays like what it is, which is a standalone spin-off made by a third-party studio.
No such thing as a Batman, huh?
Then the final piece of the puzzle is Arkham Knight, released in 2015, following the same trend that City set after Asylum, kicking things up yet another notch. Because this time you're not limited to a cordoned off area of the prison, instead the game takes place over the entirety of Gotham City.
What are you doing here?
After Scarecrow sets off a new strain of his toxin which causes the majority of the law-abiding population to flee, giving those criminals free reign.
The only people left on the streets are the sort that enjoy the chaos.
The silver ute cuts in front of oncoming traffic, smoke billowing from the burning tires.
The Arkham Knight in the title also referring to the new main villain, a mysterious mercenary who somehow knows all of Batman's secrets, and is the head of this militia force that's working alongside Scarecrow.
Who are you?
It also brings back some familiar faces like Two-Face, the Penguin, and Poison Ivy, all returning from Arkham City. And that's really the dilemma I have with this one, is how I can't help but feel that it's just retreading some familiar steps. Especially considering that, yet again, they brought back the fucking Joker. I mean, despite that intro making it very clear that this guy's dead, he still shows up early on in the campaign as a sort of devil on the shoulder, representing Bruce's wearying mental state and taunting him throughout the story.
Oh, don't act all surprised, Bats.
Because yeah man, it's not like in the other games we haven't had the Joker chiming in every 2 minutes to talk to us, is it? That was sarcasm.
No shit.
But I think the main issue is that Knight had to come on the heels of Arkham City, a game where it truly nailed the formula of everything you'd want to see and do when playing as the iconic Caped Crusader. And when you've absolutely already mastered something, the question is, where do you go from there? Well, in Arkham Knight's case, it just seems to be adding in even more features, mechanics and gameplay elements to the point where it just starts to feel extraneous and superfluous. Like with the combat, for instance, adding in all these new enemy type variations to the extent that it really does start to feel a bit muddled. You've now got a medic that can revive unconscious enemies, there's a guy that can charge and tackle you, there's more variations on the ninja guys with swords, there's big armored guys with blades on their arms, along with everything else returning from Arkham City. The inclusion of environmental takedowns and being able to pick up melee weapons is a nice touch, but it also adds in another element of visual clutter to the presentation, with every second item and object now having this bright blue glow. And it's not that I hate it, but I've just always felt that the melee combat here isn't as fun or as free-flowing as it was in City, because there's just so many more little mechanics you've got to consider. What's really been affected the most though are the Predator stealth sections, because there's an outright reliance now on the so-called fear takedown mechanic, where Batman can chain takedowns one after the other at super speed. And it looks awesome, don't get me wrong, but it's impossible to do this without making a shitload of noise. And the removal of basic things like a silent double takedown almost forces you to use this if you want to take out more than one enemy at a time. The inclusion of the Batmobile is absolutely awesome, considering it's something that's been constantly teased in the previous games, but there's also a definite over-reliance on this mechanic as well. Because it seems every 30 seconds you're having to go into combat mode and fight back against all these unmanned drones that come out of the woodwork. This is where it almost plays like a third-person shooter, with strafing and aim controls where you've got to slide around, avoiding incoming fire while shooting back at the drone's weak spots. And this just often goes on, and it really does become boring, especially when you go up against these tougher armored tanks that can only be damaged by firing the cannon up their ass.
Taking a hit! Diverting 2 Cobras now!
Even just as a means of traversal, the Batmobile is fun, but you'll quickly realise that the grapnel boost is easier, not to mention faster, able to bypass roads entirely and let you just take the path of least resistance to where you need to be. You know, wherever that actually is, being one of the dozen or so things you always need to accomplish.
The victim had a hip replacement. Scar tissue hasn't fully healed, so it must have been recent.
Most of which are lengthy, complex, and elaborate, and the new Riddler Challenges are a perfect example of this.
I'll see you soon, Detective. There's a lot more to come.
That's what she said!
Now in Arkham City, these were just a series of basic mechanical puzzles that Nigma managed to hide around the city, along with those death trap rooms he'd constructed in all of these abandoned buildings. In Arkham Knight though, these are these humongous industrial-sized environments, a lot of which require Batman to race around these courses in the Batmobile, shifting around giant obstacles with precision timing to make leaps across bottomless pits. And the very notion that the Riddler was somehow able to construct all of this stuff, it just seems so silly and over the top. I mean, you'd need a full-on construction crew working for weeks, if not months, just to make one of these. And yet somehow he's been able to make half a dozen of them all across Gotham's underground.
Once more onto the track, Dark Knight. Once more!
There's also a second component to the Riddler content with an entire side mission where you've got to remove an explosive choke collar from around Catwoman's neck. And yes, I'm aware of the potential remark to be made there about Catwoman wearing a neck choker, but I'm tired and it's too far into the video.
My disappointment is immeasurable.
I will say one thing though, and that's that this game still looks absolutely insane. I mean, even by today's standards, in fact, especially by today's standards. This is still an incredibly gorgeous looking game here, and Rocksteady have all but maxed out the capabilities of the Unreal Engine 3. I mean, yeah, this is still Unreal Engine 3 we're looking at here. The way that cutscenes will often do these extreme zoom outs to show off large sections of the city, to then only zoom back in again with zero lag or stuttering, it truly shows off the capabilities of the technology. The modeling for all these characters is again just insane, with some really awesome updated versions for these familiar faces. And the backdrop of the city itself with this constant thunderstorm and rain just looks immaculate. I do remember this PC port being absolutely woeful on launch, so much that they actually prevented people from buying it until the issues were fixed. But thankfully that's all been changed now in 2023 and it runs like an absolute dream.
Make sure you keep up, Batman.
So look, I mean overall, Arkham Knight is not a bad game, it's actually far from it. I still really love the whole tag team sessions with Catwoman, Nightwing and Robin, and some of those scripted moments here and there with Batman being an absolute boss are really fun to watch. But I will just say that I've finished both Arkham Asylum and Arkham City maybe 10 or so times each over the years since they've come out, whereas I've only finished Arkham Knight once, and I've just never felt the need to go back and replay it again. And the reason for that is that with Arkham Knight, you have to 100% the game to get the proper ending, which shows off an epilogue where Bruce finally hangs up the suit and cape for good. And look man, I don't know about you, but I don't really like being forced to go completionist mode just to see the resolution to a story that I've already invested 9 years in. There is such a thing as a game doing too much. And I really feel like the streamlined loop of Arkham City is still there, but it's been buried under a whole heap of new mechanics, a lot of which really don't add or improve things all that much, and really are just kind of superfluous. At the end of the day though, none of these games are bad, but none of them can ever be Arkham City, which is still the cream of the crop. And try as they might, all the superhero games that follow are always just going to be pale imitations. There's a reason why Arkham City still has the highest aggregate review score out of all of these, and the fact that it still runs, plays, and looks as good now as it did all those years ago speaks wonders for how talented and honed Rocksteady were back in their heyday. So I'm just hoping a bit of that DNA is going to be carried across in the upcoming Suicide Squad game, because Lord knows man, after Gotham Knights, not to mention Black Adam, Shazam 2, Blue Beetle, and The Flash, DC could sure use a win.